Hi, good
Hi,
morning.
there you are. Do you need to let Amy Borkas in? Or
I
is she?
do. Oh, actually, it's set up right now where it's not, you have to admit anyone because it gets too difficult that way. So there she is. Essentially, I would just assign right now her as co-host, if that's okay.
Can you assign us both as co-hosts? Because I'll moderate the chat and help while she's talking, and then she might do that a little bit while I am, and we'll both might share.
Much better idea. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and just make you both co-hosts now. Let me get into the participant section. Hold on. Huh.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
The presentation we did in August was a breakout, and so right at the 45-minute, it just closed automatically. And I'm wondering if that will happen today.
So this one is set up for 11:30 to 1:30, or actually, yeah, to 1:30. So it's set for a 2-hour block, and a little bit before, a little bit after, to make sure that there's enough room. So as long as we're done by, 1:15 is technically when we're supposed to be finishing. And then we have our 1:30 coming on at that time. So 1:15, if we're done, if it takes another 5 minutes, that's okay. And then at 1:20, 1:15 to 1:20, then I'll log into the next Zoom meeting.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah.
And it was promoted at Woodland as beginning at 11:45 or 11:30?
Beginning at 11:45.
Okay, good. Okay, great.
We had exactly a 90-minute window. We wanted to give people a little bit of a break because the keynote was from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. So a little bit of a break from 11:30 to 11:45.
Oh,
Before
great.
they jump into one of the 3 different ones, right? Because we have the STEM, which is this one, and then we have the liberal arts, and then we also have the CTE one.
Great. Amy, do you have any questions to start?
No, I think.
Perfect. So I went ahead and made both Amy and Inger co-hosts.
Great.
And for some reason, I'm still showing up as host. I don't think that'll change anything, will it?
It shouldn't.
Okay. And if it's okay with you two ladies, I'd like to just, if it's possible, to make just an announcement to have everyone put their name into the chat feature. That way they can get flex credit. And then what I will do behind the scenes is just send a message out at the beginning, at the very end, to ensure the same thing. Okay?
Sure.
Thank you. And welcome.
Rosalba, how many faculty do you anticipate? Best guess.
Let's see. And I go by Rosie. It's easier for people.
Rosie.
Yeah. There you go. So we would have to look at the registration. So all participants were encouraged to register prior to, and I don't have the registration list on hand. So far right now we are showing about 6 people logging on right now. So this is a STEM one, correct? So give people another couple of minutes to kind of, acclimate to the next one. They should be logging in within the next 2 minutes or so. You can start obviously whenever you'd like.
You are dealing with STEM people, so we're a little on the slow side. We procrastinate. I would guess 12 to 14.
Oh, the 14, okay.
But that's a guess.
So we're about halfway there then, Professor Clark.
If the biology part-timers show up in full force, it could be 20.
Wonderful.
Good to know. Cool. So, Rosie, did you just say, so are we getting introduced or are we just starting when we?
So let's see. To answer your question, we have Julie Brown, our full-time chem professor, is designated as the person doing the introduction, co-hosting.
This is Julie, but I don't have any biography biographical information in order to do that. So if you have it, I'm happy to read it.
Okay.
We could definitely introduce ourselves as people, maybe just a quick intro to what you're hoping for, how this came about, or just a little background about here we are, something like that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Do you want, are we starting now or are we waiting for who's here?
So it is 11:46. We currently have 11 participants, excluding the actual presenters and myself. So presenters are you can more than welcome to start whenever you choose.
All right. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry I'm having technical issues. I'm not sure why I'm not showing up on there, but I came into my office to participate because my home Wi-Fi isn't so great. And now I'm kind of, my Wi-Fi here's not so great. Anyway, so here today we're talking about equity-minded practices in STEM classes. I'm super excited because I'm hoping that we're going to get some great information that we can put in our syllabi to make our classes more equitable, so we can be more open to all students. And I'm really looking forward to what I'm going to come away with on this, and I hope all the rest of you are too. So welcome, Amy, and go for it.
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Amy Borges. I'm from the biology department at Laney College. So yes, we are going to have some specific examples of things for both in the syllabus as well as in class, and we'll get to that part. But we're actually just going to start with a little bit of background on our story. And since my colleague, Dr. Inger Stark, is going to start with that part, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me 1 second to do that. But if you want to put anything in the chat, comments and things, we usually utilize the chat versus the raise your hand option, just so we can kind of keep better track of comments. And there are a couple places we're going to ask you your opinion. So I'm going to hand it over to Inger now.
So hello, Woodland College, welcome. We've been looking forward to coming and speaking to you today. Quickly, if you attended the session during your pre-semester flex day about the Peralta Online Equity Rubric, will you just mark yes in the participants feature so I can see how many of you already heard a little bit about it? So Didem and Maria Guzman and Kevin Kelly and I presented at the pre-semester flex in August, and I'm just wondering if any of you were there. And it looks to me like nobody was. Okay. We're there, or if somebody shows up who was there, then what I'm going to cover will be just a little bit of a refresher. So I'm going to try to go slow enough to keep you with me, but I'm going to go faster than I normally would. Okay. So will you flip to the next slide, Amy, please? So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk, well, first of all, let me do logistics. Amy will watch the chat feature while I'm speaking, and I'll watch the chat feature while she's speaking. So feel free to put questions. We are going to have time for Q&A at the end. So write questions down. We'll share at that point. And Rosie, you'll still be with us at the end to help unmute people and do the Q&A, I hope. If not, we'll wrangle it. So a couple of other logistics. I'm sure most of you know this, but if you're having trouble with your internet being stable, you can always turn your video off if it's on, because that helps reduce your own bandwidth in your own home, and stay muted when you can. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a brief overview, like a 20,000-foot view of the Peralta Online Equity Initiative, tell you how Amy and I landed here in this workshop today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the equity criteria that were developed at our institution. We're not here to sell you our own equity criteria. We're here to encourage you as Woodland College in the STEM disciplines to develop some system for yourselves to increase equity in your courses. Amy is the expert in actual sort of on the ground with students pedagogy in STEM and how to apply those equity criteria. So she's going to give you some specific examples of how she has reformulated her teaching and courses to align to the equity rubric and some suggestions. We'll talk about community building around equity because that's a really important part of our equity criteria. And it's also a really great way for you as faculty at Woodland to build community around an initiative for yourselves. So did I miss anything, Amy? No, okay. Next slide. So the first thing I'd like to do, if I could, is to ask you to write one sentence. Now, I know it's really hard to do just one sentence, but we challenge our students to be, formulate their thinking in a way that's succinct. So I'd like to challenge you in the chat feature for each of you to write one sentence that is what you think equity is, what equity means to you, all right? One of the things there's a lot of people right now talking about all around education, actually all around the world, about inclusivity, diversity, equity. And if we don't have sort of an aligned understanding of what equity means, then it's hard to have a discourse, a dialogue, and create community around it. So I'm wondering if folks could go into the chat feature and enter what equity means to you. One of the things that we recommend that your institution do, particularly maybe you as a community in STEM, would be to have some dialogue around what equity means to you in your courses and your discipline and at Woodland College as well. So some people say equity means both equal access and parity. Okay, some people are saying it means fair for everyone. All right. Some people say it means when a student are in the areas of resources and knowledge, excellence, offering resources as per individual students' needs. So that one sounds like it's focusing on whatever student specific and unique needs are, which is great. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about how we came to our dialogue around equity and then how we launched our own equity initiative, offering resources as per additional student needs. Yeah, I saw that one. Okay, those are great. Those are all really great starts. And by the way, good job on only one sentence. Because that's not easy, especially with a difficult concept. So next slide, Amy. Okay, so we started an initiative way back in 2017, and we as a kind of a community, it came not out of the sort of equity initiatives that already existed on the college campuses. It came out of the community that was working to support students in online learning. And it came up because we had, for the first time, we developed some data that made comparisons between students in face-to-face classes and students in online classes. And what that showed us by the slide, you can see we have 4 colleges in our district in Oakland. COA is 1, BCC is 1, Laney is 1, and Merritt. And what we did is we compared, right, the passing rate of students in face-to-face classes with the passing rates of students in online classes. And as you can see, there are really significant disparities in terms of those passing rates. So that was one of the things that raised our concern. And of course, in about 2017 and 18, there was a massive push in our institution. I realized that until recently, Woodland College offered a fairly small portion of their courses in line, and I actually commend you for that. So we had this rapid growth and push to go online, and there was a real concern about the support for both instructors developing online resources and courses and students taking them. So next slide. So we did a bunch more research, and what we found out is that overall across the state, the success rates, and that word success there references the state term success, right? Which basically means a student stays in and completes a class with a passing grade, that overall success rates were going up, which in online classes, which obviously that's a good thing. You would expect that as technologies improve and people have more time to learn. Next slide, Amy. But what we saw in our own institution is great disparities in terms of the difference between the face-to-face and the online. And again, this is just a different graph that shows you the disparity. So you can see, and by the way, the terms for the student groups are the ones our institution tags. So Asian is the tag our institution uses. Black, African American is Latinx, Hispanic, and white. So you can see that overall, right, Latinx and Black students, they're not passing traditional classes at the same rate as other students, nor are they passing online. But you can see the disparity between the dark bar and the colored bar, that those disparities are more for those student groups. Next slide, Amy. Okay, so last night I pulled up just a tiny bit of data on your college. A colleague helped me, and a couple things I learned that are really important for, you know, Woodland College. One is that until recently, you offered a very small proportion of your classes in online. And the reason I said before is that I commend you is that institutions that grow their online learning too quickly often end up in the situation that Peralta was in without the kinds of support for faculty and students. Now, obviously everything changed last spring and it's very different now. These are the data from your as of last academic year. And I'm assuming, Rosie, you could tell me if I'm wrong, or someone else could tell me if I'm wrong, that the ones that were considered offered face-to-face are tagged as face-to-face, even though those courses had to shift to remote learning. That's what we did in our institution. So, and you can see over on the right, the increase in online, you guys had a really slow paced, you know, growth of online learning in a really measured way. All right, the next slide. By the way, I'm watching chat, so feel free to ask questions if you have them. So one of the things that we did is before we really launched, we felt it was important to define what equity is. And many people think of equity as based in a student, what a student needs, what their unique backgrounds are, what their interests are when they come to college, what their skill sets are, you know, whether or not they come from traditionally marginalized communities or identities. And what we decided to do, and this is a really thing in understanding the rubric, is we decided to shift it and make equity about how our institution functions, right? That our definition basically said what we need to do is to mitigate, reduce, and eliminate all the biases, barriers, and impediments that students experience when they come here, because sort of ideally, a student could come to the institution with any background, any level of experience, any level of interest, right? And come and have this, not the same experience, but an experience that supports their own goals and learning. And I wanted to say a quick thing about the measurements. The state, as you probably know, their favorite number for measuring is retention and success. And retention means that a student stays in the class, right? And their term success means a student who completes the class all the way through the semester with a passing grade. Now, we all know that there are a lot of successes in students and their educational experiences that are not reflected on their transcripts. And that's why qualitative data in assessing what's going on at your institution and student experience can be really important and informative. Okay, so the online equity rubric was designed specifically to do three things. One, we based it on research. We didn't use our own pedagogy and teaching tricks. Second, we designed it to be used in conjunction with the CVC OEI course design rubric, because we didn't want to compete. And the big piece of this, and this would really encourage Woodland College to think about, is to institutionalize something. So you can go to a professional development training and talk about equity, inclusivity, and you might go leave that training and have nothing that's of use to you. Well, the reason that we decided to build a rubric was you'll, maybe Amy, you could put the link in the chat if you think of it again, or I could put it back in again. We wanted faculty to have something that they could put in their hands, put on their bulletin board, and use semester to semester or during the semester as you revise your pedagogy. So we built a rubric. Next slide. Oops, yeah. Actually, go one more slide, Aim. Yeah, so this is what it looks like. I just put the link in the chat again to our Online Equity Initiative website at Peralta, and you can download the rubric there. You can see that it has the title of each criteria is on the left, and then we have incomplete, aligned, and exemplary on the right, meaning if an instructor like you decides to reformulate activities, lessens your syllabus perhaps, then you can assess for yourself, right, whether or not you've aligned to that criteria or are exemplary. We go back one slide, Amy. Sorry, I should have put the other one next. And these are the 8 criteria that we came up with, again, based on research, in order to supplement what the OEI course design rubric does. And based on research, when you, as a faculty member, use these criteria in your design of your course, in your learning activities, in your assessments, and those kinds of things, these are research-based interventions that support the success of disproportionately impacted students, students from traditionally marginalized backgrounds, communities, and identities. And it's not like you have to figure out, how do I change it? These criteria will help you. All right, let's see. I'm running over on time. So let's go, Amy, up to the activity really quickly. Actually, let me check in with you, Amy. Do you want, should we go ahead and do the activity, or do you want to start and we can do the activity? Okay. All right, we'll go up to the activity slide. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to go back to participants. Matt says it's sort of leveling the playing field. That's a good analogy.
Yeah. Yeah, these are really great.
They are.
Definitions or terms. Yeah,
excellent.
Good job.
Yeah. You guys are kind of ahead of the game. So yeah. one more slide forward. There you go. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you an activity. I want you, the college that Amy and I work at as our home campuses is called Laney College, and it's in downtown Oakland. So I want you to take 4 or 5 minutes. You imagine you're a student. You're before an exam, you're before a deadline, your life is stressful. Everybody's teaching online. You maybe don't have all the technology you need, right? I want you right now to answer one of these questions. So let's say you need your student ID. It's important for financial aid. You need help with Canvas. You need to get tutoring, or you are having some trouble, you or your family, and you need to access mental health resources. So what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to stop talking for a second. I want you to literally go to Laney College and find out. And then in the chat box, I want you to say which one you went for. Did you look for tutoring, help with Canvas, mental health resources? I want to tell me how many clicks it took until you found what you were looking for. And you can't ask any more questions, because let's say it's an online class and as your teacher, I'm not available to you right now. Maybe my instructions are ambiguous. Oops, that happens. On your mark, get set, go.
We should have brought the Jeopardy music or something like. And I put Laney's address in the chat. It's not coming up as a hyperlink though, so I apologize for that, but it's pretty easy, laney.edu.
You helped them. You made it easier for them. It's a contest too. Whoever can come up and put the first chat in, whoever finds one the fastest and their name goes up, there will be some sort of a prize for you. I don't know. Oh, whoop.
For online tutoring.
Rosie already did it. 3 clicks to find online tutoring.
Right on. This is also helpful for us because we know how long it takes to find things at our school.
Look, you can see people's faces, Amy. They're thinking really hard and staring at their computers.
Right? Like using Honor Lock or Proctorio or something. We're watching you take your test.
Okay, 2 clicks to get help with Canvas.
It's a web advisor and Canvas student support page. 2 clicks for
2 clicks
tutoring.
to find online tutoring. Now, Julie, I'm just going to challenge you. Are you sure you actually have found it? Like from there, are you confident you can get tutoring tonight? And Michael, do you know how to get help with your Canvas now? You feel confident, not just 2 clicks, but you're confident you could get help with Canvas?
Excellent.
Yep. There are tutoring instructions for NetTutor. Excellent.
Woohoo!
Tiffany, 2 clicks to learn more about the Chromebook lending programs. Oh, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's very cool. Good job, Lainey. Yeah.
The IT director is probably going to call me and say, hey, Ingrid, did you give some woman named Tiffany Stewart from Woodland permission to have a Chromebook?
Exactly. You have to drive down and get it though. And we're only available 2 days a week to pick them up.
Keep going. There's like 17 of you. We've only got 5 people so far who found anything.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, remember, you're stressed out, life is hard. You're trying to find this and it's super important to you.
Right. You have an exam tomorrow and your computer just broke. But how are you supposed to do this? One click for the Canvas help. Right on. All right.
Awesome.
But not, oh wait, but it says, but not, and then it stopped. Wait, but not what, Matt?
But not finding any immediate online help and looking at a long page, which I thought was going to be a short page, getting me to where I wanted to be.
Page, right. Page layout is, yeah. Trying to find Canvas, right, but your internet is slow. Perfect though, right? Like how often is that true for, I know it is for me, yeah.
I know my little thing right now keeps saying, your internet's unstable. I'm like, what?
It's calling me unstable, I feel like, which is true, but you know, it doesn't have to be so rude about it, right?
All right, let's get one more. Come on, one more person. Tell us one more. How many?
Anybody finding the mental health resources?
4 clicks
right?
for net tutoring. The reason that we like to do an exercise like this is that one of the things we're going to sort of talk about later, Amy's going to talk specifically about, and is on the rubric, is human bias. And we all have human bias. There are bias for many different things, but one of the things that happens to us as instructors is we know a lot of information and we forget what it's like to be a student. We're instructors, we're teachers, we're used to knowing things and sharing that information out. And sometimes we can forget how hard it can be to do a really basic thing like find tutoring in an online environment for your campus.
I'm glad somebody found the mental health resources. That's great. But 6 to find a student ID, right? Which, especially if you're needing a student ID to get on campus right now or to get to the Chromebooks, like how are you supposed to do those things?
Right.
Yeah.
And Kay says still clicking away.
Right.
Find the student ID. Okay, never mind. You probably
great though, yeah.
We chose that one because we know at Laney it's extremely difficult to get a student ID, and that was before we went entirely to remote teaching and online learning. So it's even more difficult now.
I give up.
Give up, right? Yeah. And we would recommend trying it out for your own campus. You know, like see kind of what it's like at getting the WC. Yeah, with the college calendar. Yeah, right. Like, how easy is it to find these things at Woodland if you were a student, or even as faculty? How easy is it to find stuff? Oh, that's great.
Not easy.
Oh, these are great answers, though. Yeah, this is really cool.
Good. Amy, will you go to the next slide, then I'm going to hand it over to you in a moment. Yep. So again, I've put up a slide with the 8 equity criteria. The reason we had you do that exercise is it's going to lead into some of the stuff Amy's going to talk about, but the first 2 criteria are technology and student resources and support. And in order to even get to the rest, E3 and E8, students have to be able to find your class, get into your class, and find the kinds of things that they need. So we did this little exercise to kind of put you in the frame of mind of a student and to get you thinking about the actual criteria. You ready, Amy?
I sure am. Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So, right. So we're going to get into the specifics for STEM. And as Ingrid mentioned, sometimes when we look at these statistics and we look at the disparities between different groups of students, especially our underserved students, it gets kind of upsetting, depressing, frustrating, and often then there's all this conversation about that and not a lot of concrete examples, right, or specific things that you can add. And then particularly, I think us in STEM, sometimes it seems like a challenge because we were probably all taught to have a certain degree of distance from the impact of the material and the material itself. So if you think back to the way that you were taught, like when I was in school, Rosalind Franklin wasn't in any of the books, much less Lynn Margolis or Barbara McClintock or much less anybody of color, much less any indigenous knowledge, right? All of those things were seemingly intentionally separated. So trying to figure out how to integrate stuff can be a little bit more of a, I don't know kind of way. So I'm gonna give you some specifics and examples, particularly with starting with the syllabus. So that's great, Julie, that you had mentioned that idea of the syllabus, because this is a great place to start. And maybe you have your syllabus with you to kind of take a look at. But I'm going to highlight 4 main things that I have in mind that, especially in Canvas, that one, meet criteria of our rubric, but more importantly, are there to help support students in these challenging situations. So the first one is the technology list. And again, so that's one of our criteria is technology, but also understanding that it's not just that it's there, but this idea of exemplary, or like how we can really connect it to support our students. So this is the actual rubric itself for having technology, about clearly listing. The way I have it in my syllabus, so this is a screenshot from mine. Not only do I have the book, not that it's downloadable or anything, not only do I have the atlas, but I put in there that you do need a computer that can access Canvas to be able to upload files, take exams. One thing that was noted when I had my class evaluated was sometimes, like on phones, those pull down menus for matching don't show up for quizzes. So to note for students, the things that might be a challenge if they are using their phone. And we have a lot of students who are trying to do all of this work on their phone. So even having programs like Word, so our students have access to the OneDrive, like access to Microsoft 365, though if you've used it, you know the online version's not that great. So, you know, things of noting that, as well as I have a link to that Chromebook lending program we just talked about. I also have a note about reliable internet, which is a little more challenging to try to figure out how to support. Our college had some scholarships with Xfinity for internet, but that again is, you know, there's not a lot of opportunity for that one. But this is, again, and if it's quite early in your syllabus, it's also kind of like, okay, before we start, let's make sure we have this kind of grounded place so we all can get into Canvas. Obviously, if you can't get into Canvas, that's a little challenging. So maybe emailing the syllabus to your students or posting it on a website or something so that they can see it before they even get into the portal or into Canvas itself. Then this idea of a diversity statement. So criterion 4 is diversity and inclusion. And one of those things is having this diversity statement. I'm also going to show you some examples of assignments I have that do also align or meet the criteria, this one. But the diversity statement is, I don't want to say it's simple because again, like the way that we were probably all taught, say biology, was from a very European perspective, right? So my diversity statement reads like this. So although most of this course material is based on European science, which was mainly conducted by white men, we value and honor information gathered by people outside of what might be reflected in your textbook. So I do make a clear kind of effort to try to find other people besides who's in the text to incorporate into the class, particularly those of us that teach human evolution. We do have a section on Indigenous knowledge in my class, and to value, right, other opinions or other perspectives. I also have a link to the equity rubric in my diversity statement and ask students to take a look at it and let me know what they think that I could improve. So this is also kind of indicating this idea. I am interested in their thoughts So, and I'm just seeing some things in the chat and I just wanted to check on what is that. So like getting feedback from students is really an important part. I did skip over first because I'm going to emphasize a little more this idea about bias in science. And sometimes we were taught the scientific method somehow takes away bias, but we all know that's not really true. And we could talk about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle if you really want to, right? But we'll talk about an assignment that I have that particularly addresses it, but I put it to begin with, right? Like we are going to talk about bias from the beginning, just so then students are familiar with it, as well as feel like it's okay for them to express their opinions. The last two things I'm just going to note that I have in my syllabus, particularly with Canvas, and again, like I did not teach online before this situation. So this is, this was how do I move my major's biology online? Like this is a challenge. And one of the things I found were the due dates were confusing for them because I tend to, in Canvas, have a due date that corresponds with their calendar. And then it's open a little longer. So I have changed. So like for my informal lab reports, the dates on the calendar correspond to when we're doing the lab. And then they're open a little longer, but their formal labs are due. And I think being very clear in your expectations with students, where will you lose points or not you lose points, where is there some flexibility and not, is a really important aspect. As well as in my syllabus itself, I have links to those assignments. So if they aren't sure where to find more information about their research paper, and I do highlight in the syllabus that blue means it will link. I don't use the word hyperlink. I know maybe they are familiar with it, maybe they aren't, but ensuring that we're using language that is accessible to people. It's already science, right? So it's already going to be like Latin heavy and lots of words with many syllables and intimidating. So I try to be as casual about some of this and clear. So like this, right? So this, you could click on it and find out more about your research paper, but trying to ensure there's not so much in my syllabus that it's 70 pages long and overwhelming and nobody's actually going to read it. So these are the suggestions. And again, I'm going to go into some examples of assignments now because the syllabus part, you could definitely take a look at how it's organized, especially as you put it into Canvas, what kinds of links you want to have. I have a calendar assignment where they have the whole semester calendar and write in dates of their other exams and things. And then I also have a grades page where they get to do math and then they get to meet with me and we go over kind of what's working and what's not for them. Because a lot of this is also listening to student feedback, right? So like, and sometimes they're intimidated to talk to us. And I understand that as I was once a student in science as well. Okay, so then just some specific examples. So this is where we're getting into more of the content-based changes. Right now in particular, there's a lot of things you could pull in, particularly about things like bias in science as we're moving through our COVID times. The example I'm going to provide for you about this one, the connections of bias in science, again, like, Heisenberg's a good place to start, so you could always talk about that. Or what I do is I start my class actually talking about Henrietta Lacks. So I ask them, do they know who this is? And talk about why it's important that we do talk about these things, because this is what's led to a lot of people's distrust of healthcare, right? And we see it now. So there's a lot of opportunities for that. And I have another assignment about human bias in COVID in my class, kind of always bringing this up, but it doesn't necessarily take away from the material. So sometimes I have said, and I have heard other people say, but I have a lot to get through in my STEM class. So how am I supposed to cover all this material? When they transfer, they're going to need to know these things. But things like this also help to encourage their confidence in science. Like, oh, I see why, like I see the relationship. So we're talking about the relevance of the Henrietta Lacks story. We're also acknowledging the bias. That's a really great place to start with that research and talking about both sides. If you want, like, there's a lot of ways to present this information. But I also want to point out that I do have kind of clear directions here on how to go through the lecture videos. I teach this class asynchronously, so my videos are already recorded, right? And then I have practice quizzes and things. I also wanted to ensure that we weren't starting off with something as negative of a story as Henrietta Lacks, right? So try to incorporate different kinds of other activities. So here are my directions, but the lower half of this page also includes a link to the practice quizzes I have. I have a discussion area where students can ask each other for help. And then I have 2 videos, one on theory versus hypothesis. And I'm a big Star Trek, Star Wars person, so anything with science fiction makes me happy. And then a shorter version of Henrietta Lacks. And then we bring it back when we talk about cell division and cancer. We bring this story back again.
Hey, Aim, can I jump in for a second?
Absolutely.
So one of the things, so we've got this rubric and it's got 8 criteria, right? And the idea is that those criteria are ones you guys develop, inform the way you build your courses and teach so that it better supports the success of all students. Amy's talking specifically about bias, but as I'm listening to her, I'm having 2 thoughts. One, for those of you who are not biologists, doesn't matter. You can find examples in math, chemistry, engineering, like anything else. Amy's a biologist, and so she's put a lot of time into this. The other thing, though, is I'm looking at the images, for example, while she's addressing bias in science, she's also putting an African-American woman into the history and story of her course. And so it even connects to some of the other criteria, like how does content connect to students' lives and their futures? So the idea is that as you become fluent with the different criteria in the rubric, you develop an assignment or you do something like what Amy's doing, and it actually can have, I don't know, what's the word? It sort of exponentially have a stronger impact because it actually connects a lot of the different things. I don't know if you were going to say that, Amy, or maybe I.
Yes. Well, yeah. And one other way you could think about it, if of us are science folks too, is the way, again, like roots and mycelia, like fungus, right? So we're all trying to connect all these things together. And what's really great about starting to look at your class this way, so right, this one I would have utilized as an example of bias, like this is where I talk about bias, but right, it also includes the images and representation in the class, which is why, again, I tried to balance not just this very distressing story of Henrietta Lacks, but also including examples of people of color in a more positive light, right, and more supportive, like more discussion in that sense. But it's also content, meaning like, oh, well, of course, I don't have trust in science, like I don't, as having indigenous ancestry, like there's some thoughts there that I have for myself and that maybe students, so we have another criteria of content, meaning, right, and it also kind of fits in with that one. And what you'll find is that there's a lot of overlap, right? There's a lot of places where, oh, it's this and this, or maybe these images and other ones. So let's take a look at the second one and we can ask folks their opinion of what they think. I'm gonna show you what my idea was when I designed the next one, which is using current research. And again, particularly right now, right? Like right now, there's a lot of stuff we can utilize, whether it's frustrating to us or not as scientists. But I used this New York Times article that was Can Biology Reduce Racism in my class. Now the reason I picked it was not necessarily even the topic. I was actually looking at this in terms of our criteria. We have a criteria that is diversity and inclusion, but talks about different perspectives. And one of the great things about the way that this article is written, or the discussion, is it's 2 different people with different opinions on genetics and how they can talk to each other in a respectful way. So this is showing 2 different perspectives and then showing how you can continue to talk. It's also a great article because the names of the people are non-gender specific names. So it's Robin and Taylor. And as somebody who doesn't necessarily fit the dominant paradigm of sexuality, like, oh, this is cool, right? So that also works for me. But it's about racism, right? And it's about biology class. So I'm just going to ask in the chat, what other of our criteria do you think that this might match up with? Let's see what folks have as think.
You know, wake up. If you're not paying super close attention to what Amy's saying, now you have to wake up and you have to look at her assignment, look at the rubric, and do
Look
an
at
analysis.
the rubric, yeah. And I think it was already posted back in there, but yeah.
I just put it in a couple links ago, yeah.
Cool, yeah. Oh, absolutely, I'll share my slides. Absolutely, yes, yes. So does anyone, so besides the one about, right, and again, the reason that I think this relates to the diversity inclusion one is not necessarily because it's about race, but I picked it because of the having two different opinions part, but obviously, right, we can also share. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna say my examples and then we're gonna look at another one just for time reasons. But this one, again, the content meaning, and in the questions that my students answer about this, I ask how they think that my class could help reduce racism. Right, so again, this idea of really asking what your students, how they feel about things. And again, a lot of us in science, like feelings sounds like a bad word. Like, I don't want to, no, we're in science, we don't talk about our feelings. So that was a challenge for me to get more comfortable with asking those kinds of questions. And then also being okay with the answers, right? Like, oh, well, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way. And if you wanted to even do an anonymous kind of survey, right? So students maybe may feel more often. Yeah, okay, that's a really great question. Somebody just asked to use this article in a discussion. Okay, and that's brilliant. Good question there, because the way I had this assignment set up originally was like just answering some questions. But for me, I think, and for our rubric, for it to be an exemplary example, would include a class discussion. So one of the things I'm doing for the spring is to modify this and some of the other assignments to also include class discussion where students can post and discuss with each other their own thoughts, which I'm just gonna say this slow and pause also. That's also a good example of, it's really easy to think I have to do all of these things right now. And I think particularly a lot of us in some of our fields were like, oh, I have this checklist and I need to check off all these boxes so that I could get an A right on this assignment of the rubric. But realistically, it's like a little bit at a time. So maybe you start off with this just being an assignment where you're answering student questions. You can also see what what students are saying, you know, like more privately first, and then next semester add on the discussion, right? And see kind of how comfortable you feel with it, because you definitely don't want to add something you're not comfortable with yet that's publicly like that, right? So think about where you're at. But yeah, I need to add a discussion about this one. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really great question, Claudia. Thank you. Yeah. So what I did again, and just to kind of review this assignment. So I tried to make it clear what the purpose was here at the top. I also put what I think are clear directions. And now my students have already told me like, that wasn't clear, Amy. So I'm like, oh, okay. So let me think of what clear directions means. And then the content being relevant, right? So trying to find current research that's relevant to my students and their experience, which realistically a lot of things are. But you can also, again, frame the questions, right? Okay, so the next one, and maybe actually let me just go back for a second. So, and again, what you'll see is all of my, this stands for, which I should have said to begin with. One of the things sometimes we do is use acronyms without explaining them, which can be a way to limit people's understanding of what you're talking about. So this is my article and video analysis. And I just liked how graphically those three letters looked together. You could call it whatever you want though, yeah. Okay, so let me talk about another one, which is using a prominent scientist and in their own words. So I am a big fan of Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who's at UC Berkeley, who was one of the youngest people to get tenure at UC Berkeley, right? Again, you'll notice the layout is quite similar to the other example. So this is actually exactly the same language. And then I talk about his style, right? So like have them watch this lecture of his. It's an hour, and many of my students were like, oh, I didn't want to, but once I started, I didn't realize that an hour went by. So and again, he's local, he's at UC. This talk was from a different college, but he is around here. He studies the effects of pesticides on the reproductive cycles of amphibians. So if you remember the research where amphibians had like 8 legs and things like that, that's a lot of his research. Oh, Matt had a good question. If their opinions are appropriate and when they're not. Yeah. And occasionally, whereas I have that issue in statistics class. Yeah. So, and statistics is a really great place that you could utilize research. I would just be cautious of which research you use, right? To discuss, and then biased in the research, like how were those data collected or analyzed, or sometimes we think, oh, numbers, numbers don't lie, and people will say, but that, that's definitely not always the case, right? So yeah, that would be really good. And that might be your question here about things appropriate and not, might be why you start off with the assignment as a quiz or an assignment where students are just answering to you, so you can kind of see what kinds of answers you're getting before making it a discussion between, where all of the students are involved. Yeah, that's a good question there. Yeah. The other thing I just want to note about Dr. Hayes is that I do put a warning here because he uses the word hermaphrodite, which I don't anymore. And a lot of folks are moving away from that kind of gendered language in that sense. So I actually apply language about plants to animals. It's just easier to say monoecious and dioecious for me. And it's about animal, he does talk about animal testing. So just kind of being aware it might be upsetting to students in this sense. So this one, for me, this is one content meeting in that students can relate, but it also talks about the diversity and inclusion and prominent scientists, right? And I have similar questions here. His presentation style is really great and more of storytelling, which reminded me that you can talk about very scientific things in a way that sounds more conversational and less lecturing at. If you haven't watched this, or looked him up, he's pretty cool. But this is kind of, so what do you think about which one of the criteria might be this one apply to? And Ingrid, do you have any thoughts on which one you think?
Boy, I think this one's really good. I think it's images and representation. I think it probably is content meaning and how content gets connected to students' lives. One of the exemplary ones is also connecting students to the discipline more broadly in some ways. And I feel like this kind of opens up a door a bit for that one. Let's see, I love the why we're doing this assignment. That actually is also about content meaning, because you're actually, and people, this is so important, particularly in STEM disciplines, right?
Yeah.
Like, why do I have to know this stuff? And
Yeah.
for students to understand, it's not just because it's a prerequisite because I'm going to teach you next week in your next class, but to make it connected is super. So this one hits a bunch of them.
Right. And this, especially part of the things that you could take this if you wanted to even take it further, is that he starts talking about pollution from plants, particularly in states like Michigan, where there's a lot of industrialization, and where those plants exist and socioeconomic impact, right? Like, so you could even continue to take this even more on a, what might not be traditionally seen as STEM, but it is, right? We're talking about pollution and water, like that is science, right? So it's not only research, but then you're also looking at the impact on underserved communities, because that's where those plants tend to be. So you can tailor your questions. Another thing, and I will talk about this, right, as Ingrid said, as I move into the next section about community building, has to do with how we can utilize an assignment like this in our department, and then maybe just ask different questions depending on which one. So like even in the statistics class, you could potentially use a lecture like this and then ask them to look specifically at his statistics, right? And like, what kind of confidence do they have in those statistics and why? And I think asking those questions allows students to be able to say, oh, I think this, right? And then you can say, oh, that's really great. And also consider this part, the way we respond to our students is also part of this process. Yeah, okay, so let's do that, since the question was about building community. I have two kind of directions. I'm trying to keep track of time too. Two directions on the community building part, because there's one community building in your Canvas show with your students, right? And again, those of us who we're so used to having lab and being able to talk more one-on-one with our students in lab, or they show up early, or our labs are in a courtyard. Sometimes I can chat with them there. So some like having a courtyard conversations area where they can just post about whatever stuff is coming to mind. But I do have some specific community building assignments that I'm going to share with you here. And one is this, the first one is the meet your colleagues. And I start with this, I have it open before the class is open. However, right, we are not supposed to be requiring things before the class starts. So we do have to keep that in mind. I try not to have them have too much stuff due the first day of class, but it's available if people wanted to. And this is what my Meet Your Colleagues assignment looks like. So this is a discussion in Canvas. Again, like I try to have very clear directions. There's a video about me. So this is, I don't always show myself when I'm doing the lectures and things, but in these I do. So this is kind of mine. Then I have specifics about how we're going to have our discussion. So this is also a way that I'm presenting how I'm going to grade their discussion posts through the whole semester. Up here with the 3 dots, there is access to the grading rubric, so they can also see it. But saying things like, not just like, oh, that's great, but trying to make this a dialogue, which is hard. And I'm taking an online class right now, and it's really hard to like keep track of the threads of the discussions. So, you know, it's interesting on the student side of stuff. And then I have at least 100 words. So again, trying to have very clear directions and purpose. And on a lot of my assignments, I say like, we're doing this so that we can hopefully build a community, or I'm hoping that you move from being a dependent learner into a more of an independent learner through this assignment, like really trying to be clear, which was also good for me because then I had to think of like, why do I have this assignment, right? Is it just because I had to do this when I was at school? Which is a lot. And then I want to note here, back to that technology thing, I have a video on how to post. So if students wanted to record a video or upload a picture or not just type, right, I have the directions right here as well. Right, so this is one example of, again, and I'm kind of trying to start my class this way, also to set the stage for my class that I do value my students' opinions. I do want them to reach out to me like I am, even if I am feeling overwhelmed and things, I will try to be there for them, right? So there's this one. A more content-based example though, oh yeah, the grading room, is this biomes assignment that I have them do. This is my majors class. I teach the second semester majors biology, so that's the ecology and evolution side. So I have my students meet and design a travel poster for the different biomes. So like, what would you find in the desert, or what would you find in the temperate cloud forest, or what would you find right up in the poles? And so they are going to meet with each other as a small group. I have them do it in conferences in Canvas, but it could be Zoom or FaceTime or whatever, you know, your students are comfortable with. And again, so down here, just to note, this is the directions. I have the how to do it, right? How to set these things up for them that's available. And then they're posting it in a place. So you can make a page in Canvas editable, and then they upload their image right there. Right? And this is also the beginning of the semester. So it's a way for their group to kind of start to chat with each other. And then I encourage them to meet on their own this way. And these conferences are recorded, so I can watch them. I would say that that's been really educational for me, because sometimes they say stuff in these meetings where I'm like, what? Oh, I thought that was more clear. Okay. So they're like, yeah, I didn't understand this assignment. Like I hear that one a lot, especially in the beginning, which is actually good, right? So I'm glad they're telling me they don't understand the directions. I wish they would just tell me, but you know, I understand why it has come up in conversation, and it's been really helpful for me. And then again, I post an example of a poster that I made about estuaries using Lake Merritt here in Oakland, so that they can kind of see what it means, because I think that is also quite helpful. Right,
Hey,
so that is, yeah.
When you assess this one, which of the equity criteria do you think, you don't even have to distinguish between, okay, it aligns or it's exemplary, but when you look at this one, which equity criteria do you think this helps? And again, to the participants, I'm trying to say, Amy is not only an unbelievably creative biology instructor, and she's built all this amazing stuff, but what she's trying to teach you is how she's built it in ways that align to criteria that ensure that her course is more equitable than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, and that's great. Yeah, and a lot of these are, so we have like our 8, which I could go back and pull that one up. I didn't make that one a slide in of itself. It's kind of about, you know, the connectivity in class, right? So helping to encourage your students to talk to you, talk to each other, work as groups, support each other. This is kind of like my beginning intro. Hey, let's all start to meet as small groups so that we can support, set up study groups, etc. But it could also be 8, E7, which is our content meaning one. If students, sometimes they do this on their own, they start to talk about where they're from, if they're from places, some of these different biomes, right? Or they've traveled to these different biomes, or they've seen it in there, or they want to compare. So this one started off as a community building, and it's kind of evolved itself into also students talking about where they're from, which is kind of cool. And that's happened much more recently, but I didn't put it in the directions, but I might now. Yeah, right.
I would even say it's not only E4, which is in diversive and inclusivity, because you're giving an opportunity for there
That's
to be
true.
a sense of inclusivity in the class. It's content meaning, which is E8, right? Because you're helping them, and then also the connection and belonging. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's it. And again, like it's kind of when you start to look at some of these examples, you start to see like, oh, it could be this. And so I'm very much like, oh, this semester I'm doing it this way. And so in spring, right? In spring, I might modify it just to not overwhelm myself with trying to fix everything all the time, right? Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay, so the other one I wanted to point out is a lot of us, regardless of if you're biology or chemistry or physics, or I don't know in math, but we do a lot of lab reports, right? So I have them do a peer review pre-lab, and this is kind of similar to the biomes where I am asking them to meet. So again, at the top of the page, I have what I think are clear, right? Again, what I think are clear, a clear purpose, as well as grading policies. We have moved to doing all these simulation labs, and we can have a whole conversation about that, right? But so they have to write a pre-lab for their simulation lab, and then they are meeting with their peer reviewer using that same conferences method and recording it. And then I give them a rubric on how to kind of assess each other's work. But I tell them, like, what I really want is to hear their conversation about the pre-lab, right, and about the lab to prepare them to run the simulation. I also, in my grading rubrics, always have a thing about respect, right? And like talking to each other respectfully. We talk a lot about how do you talk to somebody about climate change that doesn't believe it, you know, and what is our role and how can we develop those skills? So learning to evaluate someone else's work in a way that's supportive and respectful can be a challenge. So trying to kind of help them through some of that. And so this one, and maybe this one is a good one to kind of think, right, of if anyone else has thoughts about this one and which criterion this may match up with. So I'm thinking of these as, as more E8, the community building ones, but yep, people are still there. Cool, yeah. Does anyone have any?
I have this image of students in the class with their head on the desk, go sleep, and going, are they that, or are they just, you know?
You know that, did you ever see, there was that one video of the guy who recorded himself taking notes and then he put it up to the camera for his online class. I always think that when I see people's images, that it's just like a video recording. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So and this one, right, maybe this is a little more of a challenge of like whichever the areas it could apply to, but you could have your pre-lab, that the intro has to somehow show a connectedness to their lives, right? And then that would also be content, meaning, and things. There's a way to modify these to be other aspects of the rubric. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna move to the other two, and then we'll look at the bigger community ones just again because of time. So I also do, there's a question about group discussions. So I have study group discussions where I'm asking them to post. One of the things I'm finding is really helpful about this assignment is I ask them, they post the question that they feel comfortable answering and then one that they need kind of help with. And I say their group could also meet through conferences. Again, I always ask them to record it just so that I can see what's happening. But it's also good to see them explain stuff to each other. And that has been a better gauge for me as to if students are understanding the material or not, right? So the exams are one thing, but how about before the exam, checking in and seeing if your students really do understand this material, because a lot of it's pretty heavy, a lot of it's pretty detailed. A lot of it you can see which students are just looking up the definition on Wikipedia and posting it into the discussion versus it being in context, right? So it's a good way to help them build community, help them build support with each other, as well as also kind of checking in on how I think they're doing. So I'm just going to move to the other side of the community building ones, and we can have some questions or look at which ones these may fit with, just because, especially again, those of us in STEM, sometimes we're like, oh, well, that works for biology, but how could that work for me in, statistics or in chemistry? And part of that is that this process has also led to more community building within my own department and even across departments. So our department has a shared DE shell where we have areas for each class and then suggested assignments for those places. Yes. Oh, somebody just put okay, so this is funny because Inger knows that I love conferences, and somebody just put in the chat, so can students schedule their own study sessions through Canvas? Through conferences, the reason I use conferences versus Zoom is because students can set up their own conference, like virtual meetings with each other without me having to be there. So, and then again, I just ask them to record it. And I've already put them in groups. Like I have a survey of time, like when they plan on doing their work, try to put them in groups that way. And then, yeah, they can set up their own meetings. Like right before this, and a couple of students just emailed me to let me know they'd done their pre-lab discussion, and it pops up in Canvas pretty much right away. So I highly.
Let me just jump in there, because Tiffany, it also depends on how your institution has your instance of Canvas set up.
True.
So,
yeah.
Using conferences, which uses a piece of software called Big Blue Button, and so your institution could turn the feature off, and then no one in your institution could have students set up their own. Most institutions, and I'm going to assume Woodland would be this way, the teacher gets to decide. So there's a way you set for your own shell whether or not students can do their own independent conferences or not. So you could talk to your Canvas administrator.
Yeah, and I would try it out. And that's one thing with having this DE shell that we share with our department, is you can try things out with each other that way too. So like we've tested out a lot of quizzes and things like that by putting it in the shell, and then, or testing out the conferences thing, like how is that working? So that is like, you can see it on the navigation list, conferences. And so, yeah, I would check and see. Or I've had other instructors or other folks that then just set up the Zoom meeting for their students and still ask them to record it, right, even if they weren't there. So they can schedule it right on their own. So if they want to meet at midnight, like, go for it. So I'm not going to meet with them at midnight, but maybe that's the time that would work better for them. Yeah. And I think it's, again, and then listening to their study session has been really helpful for me to see where the questions are coming up, because they don't always ask me, right? There's a lot of different cultural aspects to that one too. Sometimes that might seem as insulting to ask your instructor to re-explain something, right? Because if it's seen as like, oh, I didn't do a good job, that might not happen, but they might ask each other. So those are also things to kind of consider on the broader side of this. But start off, try it, see if it works. Right? Grading it, say that it's going to, like, so that people do it. I tried it as optional at first, and then nobody was picking it up. So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. And then within so this is, again, so our shared shell, and then we have things like this, like, so just to tie this also to assessment, like student learning outcomes and program outcomes, we have microscope use or equipment use as one of our program outcomes, because we all use equipment and things. As we started to build our separate microscope quizzes, we put ours in. This is the non-majors class. And then other folks, like our micro folks, were like, "Ooh, we like that quiz. Can we take it?" It's like, yeah. So now we have they modify theirs a little bit, but we can do better comparison of our student learning outcomes, our SLOs, and then apply them to our program level outcomes, which makes our assessment and accreditation people very happy, right? So we're like, look what we did, right? And this is, again, just a way to build community that came from this, utilizing this equity rubric. So as we started to think about our students' experiences in our classes, as opposed to just, again, oh, this checklist of stuff I have to do, but how can we use, yes, how can we use this process of the equity rubric, utilizing our equity rubric to help build a more cohesive department, to help ensure that the micro instructors and the anatomy instructors and we are all kind of at least starting with explaining microscopes the same way, even if we utilize them slightly differently, just to kind of reinforce some of these basic skills of equipment use and things like that. And then this is actually expanded into our division. So our chemistry folks are always like, wait, what are you doing? And it's been really good about starting conversations with how we ask for lab reports versus how they ask for lab reports versus how our physics people ask. Right? So again, kind of utilizing these different, this process of looking at courses in equity as a way to connect better, or even connecting with non-STEM folks. So I talked about Henrietta Lacks in the beginning, and I'm going to pull it back, right? Let's go back to Henrietta Lacks again. I know some of our English teachers are utilizing that book. So why not talk to them about what they're utilizing, talk about Henrietta Lacks, and then I can talk about it. And if we have shared students, right, we can kind of do those comparisons. So those are some of the ways, particularly the implication for US faculty, that utilizing this process of coming up with what does equity mean to you? What does it mean in math? What does it mean in physics, right? What does it mean in geography? And then coming up with different assignments that maybe could be modified, right? Or meet more than one criterion. And that, yeah, absolutely. Yes, we can talk about conferences versus Zoom. I love too that this is also where this went, because as Inger said, she and I are on a like, everybody should use this. So this is awesome. Yeah, and then right, we can talk. That is the one place that that it doesn't necessarily work is if you want people from outside the course to come in. But yes, so this is kind of, and again, utilizing this process as not just for data collection, right? Not just for checking it off a list, but also, right, trying to build a more cohesive community on your campus by having these conversations, which will reflect itself in the classroom, right? So once you start thinking this way, then you start to see stuff a little differently. Yeah, that's great. Inger, so this is our, like, trying to build community side. So this is one of my favorite images that I put in all my classes, and it's on our website. But do you want to take this privacy differences between conference and Zoom?
Well, actually, I should say just really briefly, it also depends on how you use Zoom. So the majority of our faculty don't use Zoom embedded into Canvas. We had a number of problems with that. So I don't know whether or not you guys have ConferZoom set up LTI linked inside of Canvas. Many of our faculty are using Zoom outside. In other words, they're just using links and using it external. And I can't even tell you, I'm sure you guys had these problems with the Zoom bombers, people joining, I mean, anybody who has a link and the password can get in. The storage of the recorded Zoom recordings, essentially, our students don't actually have access to store recordings themselves, which I actually believe is a privacy issue. So if you use conferences inside of Canvas, you know that even if students are meeting on their own, that recording is being stored internal to your class. Whereas if you use your Zoom, it's being stored by Zoom somewhere else. So those are just a few. It also depends on how your institution authenticates into Canvas. For us, Zoom is basically an external document. We can't, people can't get into Zoom through our single sign-on. It has to be a separate sign-on. So for us, it's really difficult.
Yeah, and Matt just said that most people there are using ConferZoom inside Canvas, which is good. Yeah, that didn't happen on our campus when we moved into like this COVID world. And then there was lots of lots of things happened. So yes, yeah, but that's really great. And that's, like I said, utilizing those tools that are already there in Canvas is something to consider. Like, oh, how could I use this tool slightly differently to increase the equity in my classes, right? So, or increase the student experience as part. I think a lot of our students show up in our classes, it might be the last thing that they took, right? They've been putting it off. They're going to transfer, graduate. They're already intimidated because of the way that science has been presented, right? So trying to ensure that when they come into your class, they feel welcome and that there's open discussion, right? It's like starting it off with a like, hey, kind of more friendly tone, right? And then trying to see how you can utilize what's there all, in Canvas.
And one of the other things is you have to remember, like, cognitive load for effective use of technology in and of itself. I know it's a lot for you all. It's a lot for us. For students, it's probably be even more so, right? Because at least you probably could call your dean, your department chair, a colleague, or say, you know, I have this thing, or you can help me. Students often don't have that, right? So in my new role as the staff development officer in my district, I just took on the whole project of trying to teach everybody how to use Microsoft. And the first meeting was in Teams. And you should see me try to show up and use Teams because I'm so used to conferences, which is Big Blue Button, and Zoom or Google Hangouts. And so now I'm like, oh my God, I have to use another one. So in a way, Matt, what you said is actually really good. The more alignment there is, whether it is Zoom and Canvas or possibly conferences, the fewer times students have to figure out, how the heck do I do this?
Yeah, and that's also a good place for that. You having a shared Canvas shell for your department, you get to kind of see what other folks are doing. And then, you know, maybe trying to, especially like between 1A, Biology 1A, Biology 1B, we really try to make sure that a lot of our stuff is similar or builds, like, so whatever they utilize in 1A, they're going to still utilize with me in 1B. So that, right, you're not asking them to learn a whole new thing every semester. Yeah.
Before we
say consistency, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, Amy. Before we open up for questions, let me just tell you one more piece of information. Then we actually have lots of time for questions. So, Beth Allen saw a presentation that some of our team gave, I don't know, a year and a half ago about the equity rubric. And she got a number of your colleagues, I believe Shannon and a couple other people, I think it's 2 deans and 1 faculty lead, someone who does instructional design. And they came to our team and said, can you help us do this stuff? So we gave a presentation at your pre-semester flex and talked a little bit about the stuff I did at the beginning. At that presentation, they didn't get the benefit of someone like Amy, particularly in STEM, kind of drilling down to how this stuff works. But one of the things they're interested in doing is bringing a number of our team members back to Woodland to actually teach a 5-week, we call it the online equity training. It's a 5-week fully online course that's taught by 2 of our equity trainers, someone like Amy, and there's about 7 other people on the team. It has a teaching assistant. And in 5 weeks, you go through and learn how each of those criteria, you learn the research and the background on why the criteria exists, that particular criterion even exists on the rubric, how it can have an impact. You analyze other courses, so you begin to think analytically about how this works, and then you actually have opportunities to build your own stuff. So I'm not making a pitch because I want you to do it, but I want you to know about it. And you could check with your deans or Beth Allen about when that might start or not. But Amy, do you want to talk at all about having been through it in the spring or whatever?
Yeah, definitely. And I just put the links back into our DE page as well as the rubric again. So if you want to kind of see how our distance education subcommittee works and things like that. And it was really great to kind of go through that class and then look at my own class. And I started with my non-majors class, though obviously all of that stuff is applied to my majors level classes. And again, a lot of this moving into this online world, this is not something I ever thought I would do. Like, I didn't think I would teach online ever. So, you know, the situation presented itself, you could say, for me to learn. Okay. And then it really got me to think of those assignments. And like what was mentioned about, like, right now, I have a lot of assignments that are just, you know, do this, answer these questions, but involving more discussions is a really something that I would like to apply more. So there's always more that could happen, but like I said, I'm trying to do this stepwise and see how it functions here. Or we tried something over the summer that totally worked. And this semester, not at all. Right? So it's like, all right, well, that depends on, the groups that we have, as we all kind of know. And this is such a different experience anyway. But it really got me to think of how sciences can be taught in a different way than the way I learned, for one, in a way that's more, again, welcoming to all of my students, which was my goal. Yeah.
And there's a kind of a, I don't know how many of you are on the inside circle of this, but there's like a statewide, even national wide movement to move away from moment in time testing. And of course, STEM has the loudest voice in opposition to this movement. But like UC Berkeley refuses to allow, prior to the COVID crisis, they refused to allow their online teachers to do moment in time testing. So they don't have browser lockdowns. They don't have any of those kinds of things. So it's a whole potential pedagogical shift. And I'm not saying what you should do, because I'm not a STEM, I'm not trained in any of the STEM disciplines. But so anyway, that 5-week course is going to be at Woodland College. I'm not sure when it's going to start, but it will be members of our team teaching it. It's co-taught by 2 people, facilitated by 2 equity trainers. It's a great opportunity.
Yeah. And Ingrid, is there anything in the file that we have that would prevent us from just uploading our slides right now into the chat?
I was thinking,
are you fine with that?
I think everything is like, all your slides are they're no live links, right? Because they're all just print screens of the documents.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
you
can put it right in if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do that then. And but definitely, so I did kind of go through those. Like, I wanted to show examples, and like I said, I think for me, sometimes even going through the equity class was like, okay, but I don't know how this would apply to me, because class was more for humanities, social, like, side of the world, in my opinion. So, but we're updating it to have more of these kinds of examples and things. But so it was just why there was, a number of examples that I kind of moved through, just so you could have some ideas. But again, it really is that question of, like, maybe you're already doing something about molecules, and I'm biology focused. So how can you relate it to diet and food, and or even like perceptions of diet, right? Like, we all hear people talk about, I'm not going to eat any more carbohydrates. Like, well, that's not actually going to work for you. So, right? So how can we talk about science literacy in a way that's supportive, not condescending, right? Which is also kind of sometimes hard. And then, utilize it so students can make those connections to their own life, right? Like I said, we use Henrietta Lacks in the beginning. We also use diabetes through our non-majors class because it affects so many people, and you could tie it into a lot of places, right? And kind of always revisiting it with each kind of topic, but coming up with like a theme in a way. Okay, cool. So it should be there. The slides should be in the chat, but we could also figure out a way to email them to Shannon or somebody too. Yeah. Are there questions about any of those, or the experience I've had with my students so far?
So yeah, we almost have 15 minutes. So
yeah,
I believe people can unmute themselves. I don't think they're
agreed.
Jump in, people.
Right. Let's be more community oriented and right. Yeah. Or actually, I would like to know, what we didn't do is ask where everyone's from, like which STEM area, are you from? Like, we know there's some math folks and some biology folks, or Matt, you just undid yours. Yeah. If you want to put in the chat which area you're from, that would be kind of cool to see.
So I outed myself as math and stats already.
Cool.
The question I have is, I'm brand new to remote teaching as of the middle of last semester. And every time I turn around, somebody is showing me things I can do to make things better. And I've got 2 fears. One is that I don't know how to sort out which of those things are really going to make the experience better for my students.
Yeah, I think
Second concern is, at least historically, students at our school have been a little bit behind the curve in technology. And I don't know, equity is one thing that we're really concerned about right now. And I'm not sure how piling on additional platforms and or tools is going to work in the opposite direction of equity, because the students who have access to internet and have access to good computers, et cetera, are going to be that much farther ahead all of a sudden than the students who are lucky to get internet access.
Totally. Yeah.
Advice or recommendations on how to balance?
Yeah. I do. And that's really funny because Ingrid and I've also talked about this a great deal. I'm not a huge fan of those LTIs, which I think are learning something. I don't even know what it stands for, but those like additional things like Flipgrid or Padlet or adding in, or even like Google.
Lobster.
Yeah. So I tried to figure out how to use Canvas to do those things so that they're only having to log in one thing. I do use a simulation lab for my majors class, but tried to figure out ways of not having to do that in my non-majors class for that exact reason, because it's such a boundary, right? Like, and I said, like I had mentioned, putting the note that if you're doing this on your phone, like, please let me know, because let's try to figure out a different way, because a lot of the stuff you can't do on your phone. So with that said, though, I would also say for this semester, maybe just try one thing, right? Like one way to increase the equity in your class this time around, because we're also learning how to use Canvas. Like I said, I never taught online before. Luckily, we had Canvas as like a support framework for our classes, so I at least knew more than some of my colleagues who had not. But the same is true for our students, right? They're having to learn, or maybe they're all getting announcements on Sunday night. Like maybe that's too much. Like, I don't know. So I'm using this semester as a way to learn how they're doing, and then apply, right? So for science, so we like, right, hypothesize, test, apply. Not to say that I don't care about my students being successful this time around, or the class being equitable this time around, right? Because I do. But I also don't want to throw too much at them. Yeah, does that make sense? So
Absolutely it does. You kind of evaded my first question, though. Is there like a top 10 list of recommendations, even within Canvas?
yeah, so I can, so
Yes, because
specific.
I've been relying primarily on announcements and discussions and breakout rooms. But
Yes, yeah.
sounds like you think conference should subsume all of that, or take at least a lot of that off the table.
You know, and I think that's one thing that, so like having these small groups where they have a group and they have discussion areas where there's options then. So not only maybe they're meeting in a breakout in your class, but also they can communicate with each other. You can set it up so they can also create their own discussion areas. So I haven't had them utilize that, but I've pointed it out. Like you can start a discussion about how to run the simulation labs if you want, or email with each other. I prefer the discussions with each other. So if it's anything scientifically inaccurate popping up, I can see it, you know? But they have those things. And that would be a place like maybe try an assignment that is them discussing the homework, so that they can ask each other for help with the homework. Also, like we mentioned, like if they're doing their work at 11 o'clock at night and they email me because they don't understand the assignment, I don't know, because I don't have my Canvas telling me that they're emailing me at 11 o'clock at night, but maybe one of their colleagues is online, right? So that is a way that you can integrate in, and that's already in Canvas, right? The discussions are already there, if that answers your question better. I do have a survey in the beginning of kind of when people are going to be doing their work, like I said, which is how I put their groups together. But
the other thing, your question had two kind of other components that I heard, and this is from my sort of being a DE coordinator thing. One is that when you say students are behind the curve, what I would say is no, Woodland College is behind the curve, right? And so one of the things you want to do is really advocate, and all of your voices as faculty are the voices that actually give voice to what those students' needs are. So like you could go and say, oh my gosh, Laney College, Tiffany's going to drive all the way to Oakland and try to steal one of their Chromebooks, right? So you've got to advocate, because you guys are the ones that know what those needs are for students. And in our definition of equity, there is no student behind the curve. They come and the institution must meet them, right, and get rid of any barriers. Like literally in an ideal world, I'm not saying you should do this right now, obviously not, but your syllabus would tell students where they can get everything they need, right? And that's where we're headed, hopefully. The other thing I wanted to say is that that what works for you, and I see like Tiffany has said she could help you with groups, and other people are saying, so you building communities right there is invaluable, because what works for you and what works with your brain teaching might not for another math instructor or another math instructor. So it really also is like just going slow enough to learn, you know, what works for you and how do you do it. And as Amy said, kind of just get really good with one thing and then maybe grow another, kind of start at discussions light, or, you know, conferences light this semester, and then I'll learn it. The other thing we often tell faculty is don't ever use an LTI until you've found out a way to use it from a student perspective. So it's so hard when faculty say, like, I don't know if you use like my Open Math or some of those other math LTIs or Labster. We try to figure out, he's shaking his head no, we try to figure out a way that you could actually see what does it feel like to be a student in that LTI, because being a student in an LTI can actually be very different than being the instructor using that LTI. So, and if you don't know what that student experience is, you can't even design it properly pedagogically. So,
and that also goes to this idea of like, we built our district, I should say, like we built our equity rubric based on what we thought would be useful. But that's where that conversation about how does equity look, what does it look like in the math department at Woodland College? You know, so like, what are things that you like, obviously the technology thing is big. So maybe there's other aspects of that you aren't sure how to do. So like, this is stuff like, okay, well, how do we figure out how to do this though? And maybe in the discussions, you know, answers will come up as we talk more, right? Like we tell our students that when a lot, like, well, you know, the more you talk about it, then the more it might make sense. And that's true for us also. So maybe having these chat conversations with each other, even about what they're using or what they tried and didn't, can help. So we don't necessarily have a top 10, like, but that might be something to come up with, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
the other thing I should say is you guys are really lucky. Like, you're a relatively small college, and you have administrators who are out in front on this, right? In our own district, it's 4 colleges with the district office. We have 1 instance of Canvas, and it's been, I'm sure it's been hard there too, right? But it's been sort of chaos since March, and we can't even get, in some ways, we can't even get our own district to grab a hold of some of the things we're screaming that need to be done. So I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but I envy you right now, actually, because they asked us to come and talk to you, right? Whereas Amy and I are stomping around trying to get people in our own district to pay attention.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and if this seems like it's good for you, try to get on the front end of the list to be in that first class. The idea for Woodland is, I think the goal is that we would teach it once, and there'd be some people who become, it's like a train the trainer model, and then you can lead your own initiative. And again, you don't have to use our stuff. That's not the point. The point is just to be able to sort of launch your own initiative and develop your own sort of standards, criteria, whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
What other questions?
It's cool to see too, like chemistry, and we have chemistry, nutrition, and math in here, and biology in here. Like we kind of got everybody. Like, is your geography and anthropology in STEM for you, or are they somewhere else in the world? Like they tend to move between humanities and sciences. So there's some pretty cool stuff.
Engineering program? Does anyone know if there's an engineering program at Woodland College? I didn't look that up last night.
We do not have an engineering program. That's not too far down the line. We just expanded our physics offerings over the last 3 years. So that's our goal.
Rosie, I see we're 1 minute away from our deadline.
Yes, we're close. I just want to make sure that everyone had a chance to go ahead and put themselves in the Snap chat. I said Snapchat, sorry. Put themselves in the chat, and I went ahead and I also have a copy of that as well. So thank you.
Thank you all. And yes, so the slides are in there if you have anything, and obviously you know our names if you want to, but it would be really cool to maybe see you in this class that happens or later on. Because there are some pretty cool resources. And I would say too, once you start looking for stuff, then you're like, ooh, there's this, like things start seeming more relevant the more you look. Yeah. Excellent. It was very nice to meet all of you.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you.
Normally, I would start my classes with whose indigenous land we're on, which we didn't do this time around, but that's also one way to kind of just start off, right, of where we are. But down
Thank you
here
all.
we are. Yeah. All right.
All right.
Cool. Thank
Have
you
a
all.
wonderful afternoon. Bye.